I want to start by saying that this video is going to tackle some of the darker fan theories out there, and because of that there's going to be talk of suicide, infanticide, Nazism, the Holocaust, death, violence, and some transphobia. Because why wouldn't those topics come up when you're mostly talking about children's media? Okay, on to the video proper. Chapter 1. I never should have googled Steven Universe. I started watching Steven Universe with my very supportive partner since it's one of their favorite shows, and I've been enjoying it. It's cute, its characters are fun, its art style is simplistic but lovely, and I enjoy the bright colors and the quick pace. Overall, a very nice show. So as I like to do, I went onto the internet and typed Steven Universe into the Google to try and learn a little more about the behind-the-scenes work, about the creators and voice actors. To my surprise, should I be surprised? There's a pretty loud minority of folks that absolutely hate Steven Universe. The first thing that came up in my search was a video called Steven Universe is Garbage and Here's Why. I decided not to click on it, mostly because I assume there are spoilers and we're only at the end of season 3, but secondly, it's 2 hours long. I did, however, read several blog posts about it. Some of them were in favor of the content and some of them were a little bit more critical. Perhaps the most confusing part about the video is that it states Rebecca Sugar, the creator of the show, is a Nazi sympathizer at worst and a Nazi apologist at best, and that the show flippantly evokes imagery of the Holocaust. I've learned that I will understand why this might be a universal theme of the show after something called the Diamond Authority arc. What interests me here, above all else, is that this is a trend that's been going on for quite a while. Part of the reason I asked above whether I should be surprised by the reading Steven Universe flippantly evokes Holocaust imagery is because I feel like most media, especially children's media and specifically children's cartoons, are often scrutinized and rebranded with extremely dark takes about the true nature of actions or events taking place in the show. These radical interpretations often circulate wildly across the internet, even retweeted, reblogged, and regrammed by celebrities, sometimes ones really close to the original works, which fuels the fire even more. So I wanted to take a moment to think about how we interpret things, what value comes from those interpretations, and ultimately how those trends in interpretation lead to where we are today and how we engage and share with others. I truly believe we've seen a large dip in media literacy over the last few years, across the board, not at any specific demographic, though I do think some have been hit a little harder than others. Reactionary understandings of the things that we watch have skyrocketed, with some shows denigrated for entire story arcs to even individual lines of dialogue being perceived as hateful or harmful, and shutting down entire fandoms around a television show. Innocuous details lead to theories that everyone on the show is dead, and vagaries around character motivations can paint entire shows as sympathetic to hate groups. How did we get here? How did we get from Steven Universe is a cute show for kids to Steven Universe is actually apologizing for Nazism? It all starts with the death of the author, a phrase you might have heard before. And while the death of the author has become much more literal, as is the case with Rebecca Sugar, who has dealt with a string of negative fan reaction because of their work on Steven Universe, the interpretive strategy is actually about how structures, or the lack thereof, allow us to make radically different reads on media than is presented or intended by the creator/author presenting us the information. And it's that intended bit that's especially important. Intention is a powerful part of being an author. We as an audience having the power to eschew the intention of the author is also a powerful thing. And in the age of social media, the rapid rate at which radical interpretations can cycle through populations and ultimately lead to vitriol is more intense now than ever. I want to approach this from a few different avenues, specifically how the death of the author can lead us to some radical interpretations, and how those radical interpretations affect the intended audience, spaces where we see a marriage between the death of the author and the author's intentions, and where we completely misinterpret what the death of the author is and how we use it to divorce the author from their very famous work to make it more palatable for us, even when the author has inflicted real harm on vulnerable groups. I didn't mean to make so many marriage references there, but whatever. And I'm gonna be honest with you, this one's gonna get a little complicated for a lot of reasons, so I really hope you stick with me as we untangle the mess that is media consumer culture. Okay, let's do it. Let's talk about intention, interpretation, and the death of the author and how it shaped some of the most popular fan theories out there. Chapter 2. how we killed the author. There are a lot of different schools of thought on how we interpret texts. Texts are the way many theorists talk about anything that can be openly interpreted, from books to music to television, movies, and video games. Philosophical interpretation has been widely debated for ever. See my video on tremors. Often, philosophical interpretation focuses on two major aspects of the world: physical objects and concepts. Because of the broad nature of these two categories, people have tried to create value systems to best represent how it is that we talk about and formulate knowledge around these subjects. That comes in the form of linguistics, heuristics, sociology, semiology, and many, 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 many more. But the core tenets of most of these concepts are structural relationships. That's where we're going to start our dive into interpretation. I think I'm going to capitalize interpretation here, just give it some additional oomph. Let's forego the distant past for this conversation, so no Plato or Kant or Descartes, any of those guys. We're going to focus on structuralism for now. Okay, buckle in. Structuralism was a body of thought that gripped the humanities, English, philosophy, history, social sciences, and so on, during the first half of the 20th century or the 1900s. Clarifying because I always get confused by centuries, woo. Structuralism's core tenet I'm going to go with was, since most people don't adhere to structuralism anymore thanks to the speediness of social media and news cycles. Anyway, the main tenet: the only way to understand something is through its direct relationship with other structural values around it. The idea here is that specific things, words, images, symbols, had to have an understood value based on the relational things around them, so other words, images, and symbols. And because of this structure, when we are presented with new concepts, or as we grow up and discover new information, these structural norms allow us the space to engage with new topics and codify them in a way that made sense with the already identified cultural structures around them. Structure, structure, structure. Structure gives rise to form, and form gives rise to meaning. Now, I'm not going to dig too deeply here because structuralism, the video, quote unquote, would be like 100 hours long. But there are some important people and concepts at play here, and I think it's valuable for us to chat through them. Double buckle up, kids. Number 1, Ferdinand de Saussure. Just a fun name to say, and I'm probably misremembering how to pronounce that from college. He came up with the idea that all things are signs. A very loose interpretation here, folks, so if you're actually a semiologist watching this for some reason, I'm trying to keep it light. And all signs are made up of two things: the signified and the signifier. There is no concrete relationship between these two concepts, but the signified is the object, word, image, or symbol we talked about above. The signifier is the meaning attached to it through structural norms. A common example used here is a rose. The rose is the signified, an understood object and symbol. The fact that the rose represents a flower or could conceptually mean love, since it's common to show affection by giving roses, that's the signifier. Saussure elaborates that by knowing other flowers do not represent love the same way that the rose does, the rose reinforces itself as a sign of love, and also reinforces the meaning of other structural norms around it, such as the meaning of other flowers. This is why, as we grow up, we learn that giving someone roses on Valentine's Day shows affection, even if we don't know why roses themselves are symbolic of that affection. It is culturally, and thus structurally, reinforced. This is the basis for something called semiology, defined in the modern era by Charles Sanders Peirce and developed further by Saussure, or the study of how we make signs and how meaning is attached to them. Semiotics use several disciplines, including linguistics heavily, to find the inherent structure of signs, the signified and the signifier attached. But remember, the relationship between the signified and the signifier is considered insubstantial. It's the structures around those concepts that prescribe meaning to them. Whew. Okay, I know that was a lot, but it's important because this explains how a lot of literary criticism worked at the time. Structuralism implied that the intention of the author, putting together signs to create a framework for their story, and then utilizing literary tools like characters, narrative, dialogue, etc., gave us the intentional meaning of a work being presented. The meaning was designed by the author, and the way to read the text was through the structure that the author had designed for us, obviously. Now, there was some wiggle room here, since you could possibly shift meaning around depending on your interpretation of how the author may have been structuring the work, but the text was still very much framed by what we assumed the author was trying to tell us. Ah, but remember that part about the signified and the signifier having an arbitrary relationship, even if they were ultimately explained by the structures around them? Well, that unstable relationship between the two of them is where thinkers around the mid 20th century, or the 50s, 60s, and 70s, if you need some help like me, started to pick apart the idea that these structures inherently existed and that these structures defined any sort of meaning. Many of the thinkers of the time, specifically the likes of Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, and Roland Barthes, said, wait, no, that's absolutely stupid. Paraphrasing here. They began to deconstruct structuralism, and that's when we get the very decentralized movement of, wait for it, post-structuralism. So wait, if the intentionality and structure of structuralism were untrue, and we couldn't just assume that meaning exists between things because of how they interact with each other relationally, where does that leave us? Never fear, post-structuralists would tell you that, yeah, sure, signs fit together to create meaning. We need value systems that provide us some way of interpreting things, but assuming there's some grand schema that's just got it all figured out for us, or that there are fixed types of stories or meaning that hold universal truths, well, that's all bullshit. Things are more complicated than that, and you've got to account for the chaos and individualistic actions of people to truly understand where meaning lies. Roland Barthes essentially says that it's not the intention of the author that's important. Meaning isn't fixed, but instead it is an open concept that's going to be read through the lens that the reader brings with them. This isn't to suggest that the author's intention has absolutely no meaning, but it does suggest that the author, or as Barthes called them, the author, authority, or God author, isn't the only person responsible for the work, mostly because the author is influenced by other people, other stories, and other practices. He calls the author the scripter, the person who takes from their own experiences and other texts to create new meaning for us. And just as the scripter creates new meaning from things that already exist, so does the reader, who has the ability to interpret the scripter's work how they see fit. For Barthes, works are not limited in scope to be defined by one person, the author. The power has shifted from the author to the reader, and heaven have mercy for anyone creating works, as we are now at the whim of the masses. Why did I tell you all of this? Because interpretation itself isn't fixed. That's the point. Because of social media, though, ideas can propagate and grow way faster than they ever have been able to before. And sometimes the things that are most shocking, those extra hot takes if you would, can reach critical mass much faster than other interpretive understandings of works being discussed in the cultural zeitgeist. And because the scripters of the media that we consume are now more readily available through Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Tumblr, and whatever else, we've moved into a new epoch of interpretation. Voices that are bigger and louder than the original scripters, since YouTube personalities that review media can have millions of more followers than the people who created the media, can cover or extinguish any explanation from the original creator, and sometimes even worse, the author's material is considered a direct reflection of the author themselves, meaning stories about difficult subjects, even if the author doesn't agree with them but still thinks that they're important to talk about, can label them as whatever it is that their work describes. So like a Nazi for telling a story about something that may be about authoritarianism. And because of that, they must be held responsible to their work in a literal sense by the fan base. And it's often because these reactionary hot takes rile up the crowd much faster than some of the more reasonable interpretations going around at the same time. The nature of social media and news cycles can also make it extremely difficult for people to piece together where information is coming from, or understand its context, because remember, even the post-structuralists say that things require some kind of context to help define meaning, even if that meaning isn't fixed. Meaning becomes transitive very quickly. See ContraPoints' video on cancel culture for a great breakdown on how something someone said can quickly lead to a large group of people misinterpreting the original meaning through a rather nasty game of telephone. Here is a fan theory can quickly turn into, did you know that blank show is actually about blank issue? And since everyone has to give their own hot take on a hot take, the message can get garbled quickly. Stack on top of that the sometimes caustic nature of fan culture in general, and that's when things can get especially messy. Hell hath no fury like an audience that's decided they own a piece of media scorned. The author is dead. Long live Supernatural King 420 on Reddit. Isn't this the second time I've used Supernatural fandom as my go-to scary fandom? I better be careful about that. Chapter 3. The author is dead and so is everyone else. Now we understand two major ways of reading things. Structures exist and hold a lot of power and explain things to us, or the flip side. Those structures are unstable and mean nothing, and authors are foolish for assuming they understand what their work is about just because they put it together. Loosely. I can't decide how acerbic I should actually be in this piece, so we're just going to keep going. And I know what you might be saying, but those are only two interpretive methods. But remember, these were the primary interpretive methods for the last 100 years or so. We're not going to talk about new criticism right now. Okay, so Roland Barthes killed the author somewhere around 1960, and because of that, the way we began to interpret media changed. And what's really important about that 1960-ish is that the internet didn't exist. The way that people spoke about media was much more casual. Things spread by word of mouth, and popularity was based off the hot new thing hitting radios, movie theaters, and the increasingly available television set. Critical interpretation in and of itself was different back then, most coming from newspapers, periodicals, and books, especially if we're talking from a purely academic pursuit. Information was obviously not as widely available as it is today. Not as many YouTube deep dives trying to teach you about structuralism and post-structuralism. And yeah, sure, some people were probably casually reading Roland Barthes and Christian Metz, I guess, but not as many as were in a position to have these very specific types of conversations, which were usually people in academia. And folks that didn't love the newest episode of, Leave It to Beaver would certainly talk to their family and friends about it, probably people in their community. But Betty Sue wasn't going on national news with an audience of millions to let them know that the trite storyline of little Timmy getting stuck in the well was overdone and also an overly exaggerated representation of innate fear men have about the womb or some shit, right? In the 1960s, fans had zines, usually edited by a few of the original founders of a group or fandom, and then they'd circulate them to people that were interested, again, usually people in their communities. But it was around this time that larger zines became more popular, specifically zines created by women in the Star Trek fandom. Many suggest that these fanzines created by these particularly avid fans not only saved Star Trek from being canceled, but also created what we consider fandom today. These zines sometimes featured letters from the cast, songs written by fans, explanations of some of the basic concepts of the universe, and eventually fanfiction of a sexual nature. As a fanfiction writer, I just want to give an aside that I am horribly indebted to the fans that made the fanzines more readily available and made fandom more culturally accepted. These fanzines led to fan meetups, which led to conventions, which led to wider-reaching fandom groups, and then came the internet and everything was within reach. The most niche material you could think of could have chat rooms and websites where even two people would come together to talk about the things they were most passionate about. And with the internet came the viral hot take. Now, I've been in fandoms for a while and I'm not going to name all of the names. Obviously, I've already made some Resident Evil content, but I didn't really get into internet fandom culture until I was mostly through high school and into college. I remember starting on some Envision Free, was that what they were called? Envision Free boards for things like Final Fantasy and Fire Emblem. But getting onto Tumblr and digging deep into the Resident Evil fandom, I became more acquainted with how internet culture permeated through the zeitgeist. Usually what would happen is things that were wildly popular on Tumblr would be screen grabbed and posted on Facebook and Twitter by fans. If they hit big on those sites, they'd often get picked up by things like Mashable and BuzzFeed, and before long, those kind of deeply strange Tumblr hot takes became like cult phenomena and went viral. The interesting thing about that was that the people on Tumblr had a very specific way of speaking, kind of the same way that Reddit also has a very specific speech pattern for their users. So some of these takes were being seen by people that weren't really a part of those niche blogging experiences, which I think made them feel dirtier or stranger in a way, which piqued interest more than if they were just normally on Twitter or on Facebook. And because it was harder to track down exactly who posted them, since they were kind of just being cross-posted on a lot of different social media sites and then amalgamated by BuzzFeed, which I think is notorious back in the day for not really citing its sources, this mysterious generation of ideas made them feel more plausible because it was hard to refute where they actually came from. The first dark fan theory that I remember hearing about was the all the Rugrats kids are dead theory. It was originally posted by Radio Retaliation on Tumblr and goes something like, Angelica created all of the babies she's cruel to because all of them either died of natural causes or were in accidents. This explains why Stu Pickles invents toys because he can never play with his dead son. It explains why Chaz Finster is an absolute mess because he lost both his wife and child in an accident and not just his wife. And if I remember correctly, I looked it up while editing this, so yes, the DeVilles had an abortion, and since Angelica didn't know whether their kid was a boy or a girl, she just made them twins. From there, I heard the one about Courage the Cowardly Dog, that after the episode with Fusilli, where Muriel and Eustace are turned into puppets, that's actually the last time we see them alive, and the rest of the show is just Courage acting out what happens with the puppets in his imagination due to the horrible grief he feels about everything, and because he's starving to death. I tried desperately to find the original poster for this one and couldn't find them for the life of me, just other posts referencing it as early back as 2014. If anyone knows the original poster, please let me know so I can credit them properly in the description below. And then after that one, I remember learning about Squall is Dead, which suggests that the events of Final Fantasy VIII actually take place in the dying mind of Squall Leonhardt as he succumbs to the wounds inflicted on him by the sorceress Eddy. The theory suggests that the reason this story becomes bonkers after Disc 1, which it does, is that it's actually a young man imagining what it would have been like if he was actually the hero, got the girl, and went on to save the world. You can read about that one on squallisdead.com. Like, there's an entire website for it. I love it. Okay, what next? Destroyer 47949 theorized that the Ed, Edd and Eddy boys, the Ed boys as they're called, were actually dead and living in hell or purgatory. This is the reason that some of the children in the neighborhood seem like particularly out of time, like Rolf and Johnny. The reason the summers seem to go on endlessly until, of course, the seasons take the kids to school. And also why there are no adults. The theory goes on to suggest that Eddy was some kind of con man that drowned. Ed got into a car crash in the 1950s. And Ed Double D is killed when one of his science experiments blows up. And since his neglectful parents aren't around, he's like not saved in time. And it also explains why you can never take his hat off because he doesn't have the top of his head anymore. Yeah. I've heard the one from Morvis343 that Peter Pan murders all of the Lost Boys that get too old. Atomic Bolt posted the thing about Grease being a dying dream of Sandy's because she actually drowned when Danny tried to save her, referenced in the Tell Me More song, and then flying away in the car at the end is actually her going into the afterlife. Everyone in Coraline is Dead floated around for a while. I couldn't find a singular source for that one either. I'll even throw the one out there from Waldo Mobile from Reddit that suggests the Brave Little Toaster is actually about a bunch of mental patients that have escaped from the psych ward and are trying to cope with the horrors of the world that they've escaped into. They aren't dead, but it's still kind of depressing in that same vein. There are countless other dark fan theories, and plenty of lists exist on BuzzFeed, Mashable, and all those other types of sites. And the fact is, a lot of these theories have been debunked by the people that made these shows, and some of them have a very specific response to this type of theory, which is, no, it's like we presented it. But that doesn't stop the fandom from holding a lot of these theories as potentially true or continuing to talk about them even 10 years later after they were originally posted. Generally, I don't actually care that much about these theories. I'll admit that some of them are pretty well put together, and some have fun tidbits and observations that I never noticed on my watch of the shows. Heavy on the some. Many of them have spread really far, too, and sometimes when searching for resources for this video, they were within the first few links that showed up when I was searching, much like how that Steven Universe is Bad video was at the very top of the list, followed by something called Steven Universe Criticisms. So let's chat about that for a second. Let's bring it back to Steven Universe. This is another situation where the read itself, that Steven Universe has imagery used based on the Holocaust, specifically the cluster of broken, destroyed, or like dead gems that have been fused together and been stuck in the earth to grow and turn into a giant monster to blow up the planet in revenge for the crystal gems fighting back against Gem Homeworld and saving Earth from colonization, is like a read that you could have, I guess, if you wanted. The important thing here is that the death of the author does remove any intention that Rebecca Sugar may have had for the series, right? The meaning they wanted to ascribe to the show is destabilized at best, and so it's up to the viewer to read into these things. Getting rid of Sugar does remove the fact that they were raised Jewish, and I have the feeling that most people that were raised Jewish would probably be a little hesitant to call on the Holocaust so lightly, but the author is dead, so that doesn't matter. Major criticism is also leveled at the simplistic art style and the fact that Steven is very annoying because he acts too childish, because he's a child. And lastly, the show's adherence to the idea that everyone can be redeemed and that everyone has a shot at a second chance is naive and, again, childish. This desire to redeem the Diamond Authority, again, I haven't gotten there yet, is the reason that some people believe Sugar is a Nazi sympathizer because they don't just kill the Diamonds, who are evil authoritarians that created the cluster. Deep breath. I'm going to tap the sign here and say that, yeah, of course it's childish. It's a fucking kid show. And because of that, I'm pretty sure it's not flippantly showing imagery of the Holocaust. It's a kid show. What do you want? Chapter 4. I'm glad you're glad the author is dead, but not everyone is. I've tapped the sign and now it's time to break it down. With all honesty, the nature of these fan theories is of no consequence to me. So why then are you making a video like this, Oliver? Well, I find the trend both interesting and disturbing. You can Google dark fan theories and get hundreds of hits. These dark hot takes are a great way to get engagement, especially the darker they are and the more prolific the media was either now or in nostalgia. The people who write them often get lots of questions asking for further clarification. They get posted on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and sometimes even picked up by other sources. They can become increasingly popular, and let's be real, all of us are in the engagement mill. We love those hits of dopamine we get from the likes, retweets, and reblogs. My big question, though, is, do they do anything? And that's my biggest problem, actually, is oftentimes they don't tell us anything. The analysis is pretty base, and that's fine, it is. That's part of the reason why these blow up, because they're digestible and sometimes very shocking, and people love to be shocked. But when you read a lot of them, they have lines like, and I don't know, this one died this way, I guess. Oftentimes they pull from one or two moments really well, and then the rest of the theory is just there to try to poorly prop up this kernel that actually fits the theory. Many ignore later seasons where the status quo changes because they can't account for that within the original theory. They're created for the sole purpose of getting hits, getting engagement, not to further fandom or not to encourage additional readings. It's mostly just there for that shock value. What did we gain? And does it matter? But it's fun. You'll shout, it's fun to think about these sorts of things. I mean, I guess. I'm not going to outright judge anyone for making fan theories, dark fan theories, or posts designed to get likes and engagement. I too have made fan theories that I often share with specific tags for the fandom that they belong to. This video in and of itself is created and titled the way that it is to be picked up by the algorithm and watched by anyone that'll watch it. But my hope is that by having this conversation, we recognize that the point of analysis, of interpretation, is to look at something and find meaning in it, not just throw a bunch of dead kids at it and say we figured it out. And the problem is, because several theories became popular around the same time, people have now decided to come up with dark fan theories for nearly every show, specifically kids shows that a lot of adults watch, that come out. The darker, the faster, the better. And my problem with that, and I am going to tap the sign again, is the fact that it's often kids shows. Combing through lists of dark fan theories, I'd say a solid 70-ish% of them are from children's TV shows, movies, or video games. And this isn't some hand-wringing, but what about the children comment. I actually believe children should see material that's challenging. They should see stories that have death in them, that have romantic relationships, that have queer people in them, that talk about real things like eating disorders, mental illness, stranger danger, and everything else in between. Children need to engage in material that's outside of their worldview, that provides them an understanding of people they don't get to interact with very often, and some of the very troubling things that happen in this world. But they also need the space to do this, and guess where a lot of that space exists? In children's media, created with the very specific intentionality of the author to cater to a young audience that might need altered scenarios to help them learn through some of those dangerous or difficult topics without outright shock value. Desaturated7 made a post on Tumblr that read, "Anyone else bothered by the slow disappearance of websites for kids and the integration of children into sites meant for adults? As a kid, I spent most of my time online on websites like Girls Go Games, Club Penguin, Barbie.com, Moshi Monster, etc., etc. Now, 7-year-olds just use TikTok." Children are more internet literate than they've ever been. It's a regular thing for children to have cell phones and online profiles, but the spaces specifically designed for them have diminished greatly. Google and TikTok are the fastest ways to get information, and sometimes the first thing that pops up when you make an innocuous search is not what you're expecting. Children that are enjoying shows designed for them shouldn't have to see a video about the creator of the show being a Nazi apologist and a blog that promotes the same information and denigrates the show for being too simplistic. And remember how several of those creators have actually responded to these dark fan theories, and most of them just say that the information presented in the show is actually what's happening? It's because the intentionality of creating the show was with a young audience in mind. It wasn't for an older audience that wants to rationalize it through dead babies, murderers, or mental patients. Oftentimes, and of course this is just speculation, to make it cooler or explain why it's legit for adults to be watching the show in the first place. Or I'm also going to assume when you revisit it out of nostalgia and it doesn't match up to how you remember it, so you decide to make it like creepy to make it fresh again. If you want to watch kids shows, just watch them. You don't have to take over the meaning of the show or the space it provides to kids to enjoy it. Just enjoy it. And I want to be clear. I truly believe these fan theories have a place in social discourse around media, even if some of them are eye-rollingly bad. I guess I'll judge you there. People should be allowed to interpret works as they see fit and put those theories out there, hopefully learning and growing from the engagement they get as opposed to just regressing into only interpreting works through an edgelord lens. But recognizing the target audience for the media and being cognizant of how the propagation of specific ideas will push stuff into the front of the algorithm is also necessary. Media literacy isn't just about being able to come up with something twisted. It's about engaging the media and the audience and the fandom, and you've got to remember that sometimes the thing you're engaging with isn't actually made for you. Before we move on, I do want to say that being critical of how children's media represents people or situations is very legitimate. The people who make children's media are adults that want to make children's media, and they bring with them all of their baggage and biases. Calling out shows for specific behaviors towards minority groups or using culturally insensitive storylines or iconography, etc. is a perfectly reasonable thing to bring into question because, again, children's media is a space where children come to learn things about the world. Being able to have those conversations with your kids or kids that you know is great. Making hating a kid's show your personality so you can get enough likes and views to hit the top of the algorithm ain't it, chief. So this is one of those particularly confusing parts where Oliver denigrates some of the behaviors, but ultimately wants to reify the fact that you can make outlandish claims if you want on social media. I just beg that you understand what it is you produce, what it's doing for the show or fandom, how people that may actually be the target audience could be impacted if it becomes overwhelmingly popular, and maybe think about where and how you're posting it. Like, I'm gonna keep making videos about weird shit, and I want to see cool weird shit that other people do, but I also constantly think about the time, place, and potential impact of what I create. Chapter 5. What if the author's mostly dead? Okay, so this is the part where I tell you I only partially believe that the author is dead if you didn't glean that from the content above. Back in my school days, the place where I get all these garbled ideas from, the reserves of brain cells from back then clinging desperately to the knowledge I didn't drink away or lose while working customer service jobs for 10 years. That is a comment on the customers, not the service industry or the people that work those jobs. I used to wholly believe in the death of the author, but as I've gotten older, I've come to believe that there's a kind of mix that happens, a give and take, if you would. I truly believe that an author owns about 50% of what they put out there, and their intentionality behind what they wrote, in fact, contributes to the total meaning of the work. It's the other 50%, that bit owned by the audience, that gives us our wide variety of understandings and interpretations of the pieces given to us through both the skill and intentionality of the author. I like to turn to a fan theory that's essentially become canon. Can you call it a fan theory? I'm going to call it a fan theory. That Night of the Living Dead is actually an allegory about racism, and its story speaks prominently to the late 60s and Black liberation. When famously asked if George Romero knew that he was making a movie about racism, Romero says that he cast Duane Jones as the lead actor of the film because he gave the best audition for Ben, the main character. Because Duane Jones was a black man, and because it was 1968, and few films at the time had black leads acting as our main protagonists, especially in roles where they were not directly related to race, viewers were quick to point out that the dynamics of the people downstairs and the people upstairs were symbolic of the fight for civil rights across the United States, especially because Ben has to grapple with the antagonistic, frightened, erratic, and isolationist Harry, who believes he's in control of the entire situation. Because of the death of the author, Romero's film has become widely known for its subversive symbolism and comment on social discourse. In contrast, Romero originally set out to make a monster movie, but I actually think that his intentions elevate the central role of Ben from being solely symbolic, as many critics have pointed out. Because Ben was simply written as the hero of the story, especially at the time, we get to see Dwayne Jones simply playing the hero. While the role is ultimately complicated by the time and critical understanding derived from meaning outside of the writer's original intention, that makes Ben an even more impactful hero. Ben is presented as a person throughout the film. He makes difficult decisions, gets people killed, and prolongs the lives of many other characters until Harry ultimately wreaks havoc on the situation. The combination of authorial intent and post-structuralist analysis allows Ben to be a complex character, expertly played by a powerful actor that gives us an excellent performance and moved many people at the time and still even now. Grappling critically with all aspects of media we enjoy and consume continues conversations, can dig further into themes and narrative elements. I truly believe we lose out on critical meaning and understanding when we remove the author's intentions altogether, especially when we do it for the wrong reasons. Chapter 6: Harry Potter and the Author from the Dead. I remember when Harry Potter came out. I will admit, and not in the I'm too cool for this shit kind of way, that I never really enjoyed it. I remember reading the first book in 3rd grade and then read the next few books, and by the time I was in 6th grade or something, I just couldn't really get through the 4th book. I wasn't yet the asshole that thought popular things couldn't be good, but for some reason I did think this popular thing just wasn't very good. Its writing always felt kind of off to me, and while its setting and world building were pretty good, I didn't care that much about the people I was supposed to care about, and I missed out on all of the supposed social commentaries because when I was reading it, I was a kid. Well, do I feel vindicated now? All joking aside, I actually do send some condolences out to folks that had their favorite book series ruined by a horrible transphobic asshole. I know Harry Potter was important to a lot of people, specifically people in the LGBTQ+ community, and especially trans and non-binary folks. So it's actually very sad to me to watch the series absolutely ruined for people that it meant so much to. But that's not really stopping some people from using the death of the author as an excuse to simply keep engaging. And this is kind of where the death of the author concept can be used more for evil than anything else, because there are a lot of people out there that will simply ignore the problematic elements of the work or author to substitute their own feelings or interpretations to keep the illusion alive, that the thing they love is totally untainted by the person that created it. Another reason that the death of the author becomes problematic is that regardless of the best intentions of the author, it's likely they're going to get some things wrong, and removing those intentions, good or bad, from the work and applying only the ideals of the reader can be quite dangerous. I often see this in fandoms, that you're not a real fan if you don't love everything about the series, the all or nothing kind of fan, and the ones that are more than happy to just forget whatever it is that's bad about the newest pieces in a franchise or whatever latest controversies surround it. And I'm talking about real controversies here, not someone being canceled or whatever over something dumb, like Rebecca Sugar is a Nazi, it's stuff like that. There are some who point out that Barth, when, coming up with the concept of the death of the author, probably didn't mean to completely remove the author. But that doesn't stop people from doing it. And interestingly, this is a situation where people have removed Rowling from their understanding of her work, while simultaneously allowing her to continue to manipulate canon and essentially kind of following it. Though I should note that a lot of that happened before the reveal of her being a huge TERF. Fans would often talk about how they didn't appreciate the lack of representation for queer people, and suddenly Dumbledore was queer, specifically to make the relationship between him and the evil Grindelwald, and not trying to be an asshole here, I think it's Grindelwald, make a little bit more sense. Some fans regarded this as a revelation, quick to make the structural associations between this retcon and what was in the books already. Suddenly, so much was illuminated to them, and Dumbledore being gay seemed obvious. Others were obviously less impressed. There was also that stuff about Ilvermorny, I think I wrote that down right, or whatever it was that was created using Native American magic, which is the American school of magic. Honestly, I don't remember this one too well because if I do remember correctly, it was really tangled in Pottermore and not really in the other media. But I do remember folks being quite up in arms about the cultural appropriation of it all. When people realized that there were very few people of color at Hogwarts, and that the ones that were there were pretty much forgotten by the end of the story, Rowling was quick to point out that her description of Hermione never specified that she was white, after actress Noma Dumezwini was cast in the role in The Cursed Child. Again, some found this to be a revelation, her physical description suddenly making more sense, her brown eyes, her frizzy hair, right in front of us this whole time. And that makes sense, right? Because people want to see themselves represented, and when they aren't, that's when they turn to other methods to see themselves represented. See my discussion on transformative and curative fandom. Because these stories meant so much, people were willing to take a structuralist approach to how they understood the work. When the author spoke, it became true. When the author decided that the trans activists had gone too far, suddenly many fans decided that J.K. Rowling no longer owned Harry Potter, even though she owns all of it, and all of the movies, and the new game coming out, and. Remember, kids, trans people are more important than Hogwarts game. Suddenly, these relational values no longer mattered, but the piece of media persisted as an important hallmark for a lot of people, despite the request of others to not remove the vitriol of the author from their engagement with the work. Every dollar towards Harry Potter-related things just meant that J.K. Rowling got more money, even if she was dead. In the context of post-structuralist authors, I mean. And the problem here, though, much like all of the other times J.K. Rowling decided to say something and it suddenly became canon, why didn't her thoughts on gender and trans folks not immediately become canon too? Because even without her, for some, the text is sacred, even if she wasn't the author anymore, quote unquote. Once she was removed, any potential issue with the text went away with her for a lot of readers, and that is dangerous. And even still, there were calls that Harry Potter was for everyone, that Hogwarts was a home. J.K. Rowling couldn't take that away. Her intentions no longer mattered, but when the people most affected by her words and her intentions cried out that Hogwarts wasn't a home any longer and that people should stop supporting it, they were quickly drowned out by a vocal group of fans that held the text above other living, breathing people. Like all things, we can pick and choose how we see fit what we decide to engage in, and how we choose to engage with it. But much like flooding spaces with theories about dead babies and mental patients, we need to be careful about the ways in which we share and consume. Making spaces less hospitable for intended audiences is a huge problem, but continuing to support the works of writers that spew vitriol and support reductions in human rights by pretending they didn't write the thing that we love is also absolutely irresponsible. And I get it. Rowling isn't the first or the last creator that we'll do this with. The more famous their work, the better respected or beloved they are, the more likely their fan base is to turn the other cheek when something horrible happens. The death of the author isn't supposed to help us breathe deep and take it easy. It's supposed to challenge us to break down the value systems in a work to better understand the narrative and themes present within that work. De-troubling famous creators' work to be more palatable because you like it and don't want to deal with their baggage doesn't do you any favors, and it doesn't do any favors to the people they hurt. Chapter 7. Okay, dig 'em up. I've got one last thing to say. We've talked about a lot today. Quite a far-reaching topic with lots of twists and turns. Conversations like this are difficult, particularly because there is a very fine, specific line that we have to walk when we consider the way that we engage in sharing content. Creativity is incredibly important to me, and so when I see a particularly good fan theory, I'm very apt to like and retweet, reblog, and regram myself. But that also usually means after interrogating the theory and discovering why I like it. And that usually means understanding how it fits in the broader context around the piece it references. This is the reason that I rarely like and retweet dark fan theories, because I just can't reconcile the small bits of interesting information against the rather weak bits that are trying to hold it up. And I truly want the intended audience to be able to have fun with media without being inundated by hashtags filled with some really gross shit, overly sexual shit, or creepy shit for the sole purpose of shock, or to co-opt something that doesn't belong to a group of people just to make it more palatable for them. Because remember, people need to see media that challenges them. People need to read works about people that are different from them. They need to have works that grapple with difficult topics like abuse, sexual situations, and a myriad of other subjects. And the context surrounding those conversations is very important. And when we engage with this content, especially if it is content that we might not agree with, We really need to challenge ourselves to understand the intention behind the information being provided and understand whether the creators are trying to engage us in something that makes us uncomfortable before immediately assuming that the author agrees with whatever it is that they're writing about and assuming that it makes them a bad person or an apologist. Being critical about media is hard work, and it takes a lot of practice. Reactionary hot takes for the sake of likes, or reactionary hot takes because you don't understand the thing or think it's bad, or think the author is bad and an apologist because you don't understand the thing or what they were trying to do, does very little for the discussion. And especially in today's internet climate, it can wreak havoc on new and established creators' livelihoods, especially if they're just trying to tell you a challenging story that they think is important. And that leads me to a reminder, and I can't stress this enough. Being critical of the shortcomings of something, especially in the way that the subject matter or characters are handled, is perfectly reasonable. No media is perfect, and there are always things that we need to deconstruct and hold each other accountable for. But just because you disagree with something doesn't mean that it's automatically bad or harmful. I'll repeat, being critical is hard work and takes a lot of practice. There is a lot that goes into the things that you watch, read, play, and share. There is rarely so fine a line between structuralism being right or post-structuralism being right. As much as we like to create dichotomies and simplify topics to good and bad or right and wrong, things are rarely so simple. The author isn't dead just because you want them to be, and works aren't pro-Nazi just because you don't like how a particular storyline was handled. It's our responsibility to put the pieces together and understand how our voices and interpretations play into larger cultural narratives around a work. Honestly, this is probably the beginning of a larger conversation around different interpretive strategies. So for now, let's call it time, and sometime in the future, we'll talk about this a little bit more. I will leave you with this, though. The author is kind of like Jason Voorhees. He was alive, then he was dead, and then he was struck by lightning and tied to the bottom of Camp Crystal Lake by a Carrie ripoff. Wow, I can't believe I saved that absolute rock-solid example for the very end.